The mountains had always carried an air of tranquility, a perfect refuge for those seeking peace and connection with nature. For us, three friends passionate about hunting, that mountainous region was the ideal spot for our next adventure. We had planned the trip for weeks, and everything pointed to a successful experience. The weather was mild, the sky clear, and the mountains welcomed us with their comforting silence. None of us could have imagined that it would be the last time we'd feel safe. After a long day of hiking through slopes and valleys, we found the perfect spot to set up camp, a clearing surrounded by tall trees with a wide view of the horizon. The conversations flowed naturally as we pitched the tents and lit a fire. The crackling flames and the gentle breeze swaying the leaves created a serene setting. Night slowly fell, bringing with it the absolute silence of the mountains. We were confident that it would be another peaceful journey. With the fire lit and dinner prepared, we sat around the flames, sharing stories and laughter. The night was darker than usual, with no moon to light the sky, but that didn't bother us. We were used to the darkness of forests and the stillness of the mountains. When we finally decided to sleep, nothing could have prepared us for what we would hear next. In the middle of the night, a distant sound broke the silence. It was faint but unmistakable, the cry of someone, lonely and unsettling, echoing from deep within the forest. At first, we exchanged curious glances, thinking it was just our ears playing tricks on us. But the sound continued, faintly present, as if it were far away. It was a woman's voice, sobbing, wrapped in the darkness of the trees. Unease began to creep among us, but we decided it could just be a lost traveler or a strange echo from the mountains. Without giving it much importance, we went back to lying down, believing the morning would bring explanations. Yet, sleep didn't come easily to any of us. However, that cry would only be the beginning. What seemed like a calm night of rest would soon turn into something much more disturbing, an invisible presence surrounding us and completely altering the course of our hunt. The crying continued to echo in my mind, even after it had fallen silent in the darkness of the night. By morning, with the sun shining over the camp, everything seemed normal again. The daylight brought with it a sense of safety, almost as if the previous night had been a mere hallucination caused by exhaustion. However, a part of me couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling from that sound. Whatever it was, it didn't seem natural. When I shared my thoughts with the others, I saw the same discomfort reflected in their eyes. One of our friends, Mark, was the bravest of the group and always the first to suggest a practical solution to any problem. "It's probably someone lost," he said as he prepared his gear. "I'll go check it out, just to be sure." David, the third in our group, and I hesitated. There was something about that cry that left us uneasy, but Mark was determined. He grabbed his flashlight and, with confident steps, disappeared into the trees. We stayed behind at the camp, watching as he vanished into the forest's darkness. Time passed slowly, and the silence around us seemed to grow as the night deepened. We waited for any sign of Mark or whoever was crying, but all we heard was the rustling of the wind through the leaves. After some time, we began to wonder what had happened to him. Then, suddenly, the crying returned, louder and closer than before. Mark hadn't found anyone, but the sound now seemed to be surrounding us. Mark returned soon after, his face tense and his eyes full of doubt. He hadn't found anyone. He had only followed the sound to a certain point in the forest, where it had vanished as if it had never existed. "But the worst," he said, "is that on my way back, the crying seemed closer to the camp, as if it was following us." His words filled the air with a suffocating tension. The silence now felt heavy, and what had once been a distant soundtrack in the mountains now felt like a much more immediate threat. As night fell again, we all became more alert, expecting the sound we knew would return. The crying didn't seem to be from someone asking for help. It felt like something that wanted to lure us, to pull us in somehow. And each time it appeared, the forest around us became more oppressive, the mystery deeper. The following nights were a constant battle against fear. The crying, once distant, now came through more intensely and much closer. On the second night, the sound began right after we put out the fire. The wailing cut through the silence of the forest with a proximity that made it clear. Whatever was crying was now surrounding us. No one could ignore the discomfort anymore. I, Mark, and David sat in silence, each staring into the darkness around us, waiting as if something might appear at any moment. I slept poorly that night, waking at every noise, convinced I would see something lurking among the trees. The crying would come and go in waves, sometimes fading, sometimes so close it seemed to echo inside our minds. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, began to show signs of weariness and nervousness. "It doesn't make sense," he murmured the next morning while making coffee. "Who would cry like that for so long without stopping? It's like it's a trap." His words brought a new wave of anxiety. The idea that this could be more than just a sound started to creep into our thoughts. The tension among us grew. No one wanted to be the first to suggest leaving, but it was clear the unease was mounting with each night. We tried to continue with the hunt, but our focus was gone. Every time we left the camp, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, waiting to hear the crying at any moment. The forest, once a refuge of peace, had now become an oppressive place. I was sure we were being followed. On the third night, the sound returned stronger than ever. It was as if the crying was coming from all directions at once, echoing through the trees and mixing with the wind. This time, none of us could pretend it wasn't happening. We stayed up all night, sitting around the fire, eyes fixed on the darkness, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. The forest around us seemed alive, breathing along with the crying that surrounded us. The eerie proximity of the sound frayed our nerves. David and I were on constant alert, while Mark tried to remain calm, but it was clear he too was beginning to crack. The crying no longer seemed like that of a lost person. It was something else, something that wanted to frighten us, something that was getting closer and closer to us. The next morning, we decided to explore the area around the camp, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe there was someone nearby, someone in trouble, or worse, someone playing a cruel trick on us. We spent the day walking through the forest, searching for any signs that might give us a clue. We were determined to figure out what was happening. After all, we couldn't keep ignoring the fact that the crying was getting closer, stalking us through the dark nights. It was during that exploration that we found something that froze us in place. In a small clearing not far from where we had camped, we discovered small, freshly dug mounds of earth. There were at least 3 of them, side by side, with uneven and slightly sunken soil. They weren't large enough to be traditional graves, but they definitely resembled hastily made burial sites. We stood still, staring at those formations with a mix of disbelief and fear. Who would have made them, and why? Mark was the first to approach, his expression hard but hesitant. "This doesn't seem right," he said, crouching next to one of the mounds. The silence around us felt deeper, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. David and I stepped closer, but neither of us wanted to touch the soil. That place radiated an unsettling feeling, as if we were trespassing on something sacred or forbidden. The mounds were too small to hold a human body, but the thought that something might be buried there sent shivers down our spines. We tried to carry on with the day as if nothing had happened, but the weight of the discovery hung over us. The forest, once just mysterious, now felt charged with a growing dread. The crying continued to haunt us, and now it seemed like we knew why. Something in that forest didn't want us there. Something was warning us to leave, yet we decided to stay. Perhaps it was pride or stubbornness, but we all agreed to stay for one more night. Just one more. As night fell again, we couldn't stop thinking about the graves. What was buried there? And why had no one noticed before? The crying returned, as expected, but this time it was more intense, as if it were moving toward the graves. The tension in the air was palpable, and each of us was on edge, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. Now, we knew there was something more sinister around us, and it was only just beginning to reveal itself. That night brought with it a new level of terror. From the moment the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the crying began to echo through the forest, louder and more desperate than ever. There was no longer any doubt that something was watching us, drawing nearer by the minute. We stayed by the fire, silent, our eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. The sound came from all sides, as if the forest itself was weeping. There was no escaping it. The crying seemed to envelop the camp, slowly circling, as if searching for something or someone. David was the first to break the silence. "I think it's time we leave," he said, his voice trembling. Mark, who had been the most skeptical until then, looked at him but didn't argue. He knew something was wrong. We all did. But our pride and stubbornness kept us there, clinging to the idea that we were experienced hunters, that a simple crying voice couldn't scare us. But now, it wasn't just fear. The crying seemed to have a life of its own, as if it were calling us, testing us. Time passed, and the sound didn't stop. With each minute, the crying grew louder, closer, until we felt there was no longer any distance between us and whatever was out there. Mark suddenly stood up, both scared and angry. "This doesn't make sense. Who's doing this?" he shouted into the darkness. But all we got in response was the crying. And then, something changed. The sound, once constant and repetitive, shifted into something else. It was no longer just the wail of someone lost. It was deeper, more desperate, and now it seemed to be coming from directly within our camp. A chill ran down my spine. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror mirrored in their eyes. The sound seemed to be surrounding us, forcing us to decide what to do. Leave? Investigate? We stayed still, trying to figure out exactly where the sound was coming from. The fear that something might emerge from the darkness kept us frozen, and the tension mounted with each passing second. We were being hunted, and somehow, the crying was the warning. What happened next happened too quickly. The crying was suddenly interrupted by screams. Screams of pure terror, coming from the darkness. It was the voice of a person, no longer just a lament, but the sound of someone in mortal despair. Panic overtook us. Before any of us could react, Mark ran toward the screams, disappearing into the trees. David and I were left behind, frozen, with fear paralyzing us. Minutes passed, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. The silence after the scream was unbearable. David and I stood motionless, exchanging terrified glances. We didn't know what to do. Mark's scream still echoed in our minds, and the sound of the crying that had surrounded us was now completely gone, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The fear gripped us, and the thought of running after Mark terrified us as much as staying in the camp. We knew he had run toward danger, but what awaited us out there, in the darkness? Minutes dragged by, and the forest's silence was oppressive. We didn't know whether to wait or act. Each second felt like an eternity, until we finally decided to do what we could. We grabbed our flashlights and began walking slowly in the direction where Mark had disappeared. The forest floor was damp, and our footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, echoing in the absolute silence. The tension in the air was palpable, and the darkness around us seemed denser, as if suffocating us with each step. The fear was overwhelming, and my mind raced with possibilities of what might have happened to Mark. We were only a few meters from where he had run when something even more disturbing happened. We heard slow, dragging footsteps coming toward us. David pointed the flashlight ahead, and there he was, Mark. He was walking slowly toward the camp, covered in dirt, his head down, shoulders slumped. From a distance, he looked fine, but as he got closer, something seemed wrong. We called his name, but he didn't respond. He kept walking toward us, as if he couldn't hear. When the light finally illuminated his face, the horror hit us. His eyes were empty, lifeless. His face, smeared with dirt, showed no emotion. He didn't seem to recognize me or David. It was as if he were an empty shell, a body without a soul. He walked past us without saying a word, moving slowly toward the camp. The silence that followed him was crushing. David and I stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The man who had returned to camp was no longer our friend. Something terrible had happened to Mark, and now, we didn't know what to expect. We watched as he sat by the fire, still with that vacant look, staring into the flames as if he were in another world. The crying had stopped, but the sense of dread continued to grow. Mark was back, but he was no longer himself. Sitting by the fire, he moved slowly, as if each gesture was calculated. His gaze remained empty, unfocused. David and I stayed a short distance away, watching, trying to understand what had happened to him. We called his name, but he didn't respond. The only thing he did was stare at the fire, his face smeared with dirt, as if he had been buried. With each passing minute, the feeling that he was no longer the same intensified. The fear I felt was different now. It wasn't the fear of the crying or the dark forest anymore. It was the fear of the unknown standing before me, a figure who had once been my friend but now seemed to be something else entirely. David cautiously approached, trying to get some response from Mark. He touched his shoulder, shook him lightly, but Mark didn't react. His eyes remained fixed on the flames, as if he were in a trance. The only sign of life was his slow, steady breathing, a reminder that he was alive, but it didn't feel like life. "We need to get out of here," I muttered to David, my voice barely audible. He nodded nervously. We both knew something terrible had happened to Mark, and if we stayed, we might be next. The crying that had once tormented us was now a distant memory, but the silence that replaced it was even more unsettling. The forest seemed to be waiting, as if something else was about to happen. Every second we spent there, next to Mark, felt like we were getting closer to disaster. As we debated what to do, Mark finally moved. Slowly, he stood up and began walking, without saying a word, in the opposite direction of the fire. His steps were slow and dragging, and he didn't seem to have a clear destination. He just walked, as if being guided by something invisible. Fear consumed me, and all I wanted to do was run. The man walking before us was no longer our friend, and there was no denying it. Not knowing what to do, we stood paralyzed. Mark disappeared into the darkness, and the sound of his footsteps slowly faded. David and I exchanged glances, and in that moment, we knew the only choice was to flee. There was nothing more we could do for Mark. Fear, confusion, and the terror of whatever was lurking pushed us to make a decision we had delayed for far too long. Without hesitation, we grabbed what we could and started running. The forest, which once felt like a sanctuary of peace, had now become a labyrinth of shadows and danger. The sound of our footsteps, fast and uncoordinated, echoed through the trees. Every snapped branch, every rustling leaf seemed to amplify our panic. The crying that had once haunted us was now back, echoing in the distance, as if trying to remind us that we couldn't fully escape whatever was happening. We ran through the darkness, leaving the camp behind without looking back. The terror drove us forward with every step. As we distanced ourselves, the crying seemed to continue pursuing us, mixed with distant, indistinguishable, and terrifying screams. We knew we couldn't stop. Even as exhaustion took over our legs, adrenaline kept us moving. The night air felt colder, and the darkness around us more suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on us. David stumbled a few times, but I pulled him back, not letting him stop. We couldn't stay there. Whatever was in that forest had already done something to Mark, and we knew that if we stopped, we would be next. Fear kept us running, but at the same time, the sound of crying and the distant screams made us feel like we were being chased by something we couldn't see, but that knew exactly where we were. The trees blurred around us as we sprinted toward the only thing that mattered: escape. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, the forest began to thin out. The distant lights of the road ahead signaled that we were close to getting out. We ran with all the strength we had left, until, finally, we broke through the tree line and reached the asphalt. Exhaustion hit us hard, and we collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The crying and screams had disappeared completely, as if the forest was satisfied to see us leave. When we finally recovered enough to stand, the relief was instant, but the fear lingered like a shadow. We knew something terrible had happened, but we couldn't fully understand what. We didn't go back for Mark. We didn't know if he was still alive, or if he was still the same person we knew. All we knew was that something had taken him, something we would never be able to explain. We never returned to that forest. The experience haunted us, and the memory of Mark disappearing into the darkness with that empty look never left our minds. The hunt that began as a peaceful adventure had turned into our worst nightmare, and the sound of crying and screams still echoes in our thoughts, reminding us that something in that forest should never have been disturbed. If you had asked any of us that night, We would have said we were ready for whatever the forest had in store for us. Experienced hunters, armed with high-precision rifles, we were a confident group. Wild boars were our target this time, and the dense forest around us, shrouded in darkness, was the perfect setting. Even with the area's dangerous reputation, stories of hunters who never returned and strange noises in the middle of the night. None of us hesitated to move forward. With flashlights in hand and ears sharp, we knew it would only take the right moment to capture our prey. The night was cold, the sky blanketed by heavy clouds, blocking any light the moon might have offered. The trees, tall and tightly packed, formed a maze of shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. There were 5 of us, and our pace was calm, calculated. We were in sync, as always, moving through the dense woods with the confidence of men who had faced such situations countless times. The forest legends intrigued us, of course, but they were just part of the thrill of the hunt. I remember looking around, feeling the weight of the darkness surrounding us, but refusing to be intimidated. At that moment, all that mattered was finding the boar's tracks and moving forward. "They won't escape us," said Alan, always the most optimistic in the group. We laughed in response, ready for another successful night. There was no doubt in our minds that we'd return with good stories and a good hunt. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the natural sounds around us became clearer. The crunch of leaves beneath our feet, the faint whisper of wind through the trees, and occasionally the distant calls of nocturnal animals. It seemed like a typical night, and it continued that way for hours, with no sign of the boars we were expecting. The silence of the forest stretched on, growing more unsettling, though not enough to make us turn back. With each step, we became more convinced we were on the verge of finding something. But what we didn't know was that night, we wouldn't be the only hunters. After hours of walking with no sign of the boars, something finally started to happen. We stopped for a moment, and that's when we heard it for the first time. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible at first, branches breaking in the distance. I glanced at Alan, who had also stopped, and I saw that he had heard it too. Under normal circumstances, this would be the signal we were waiting for, the approach of our prey. But something was different, something we couldn't immediately put our finger on. The sounds grew louder, the crackle of leaves being trampled and branches breaking echoed around us, as if something, or someone, was moving in the shadows, circling our group. Yet despite the noises, no boar or any other animal appeared. Our eyes met, trying to read each other's reactions. No one said a word, but we all knew this wasn't normal. The noises continued, almost rhythmic, and the forest, once welcoming in its stillness, began to feel oppressive. "It must be a big animal," Victor, the most pragmatic of the group, said, trying to keep control of the situation. But even his voice sounded a little uncertain. He was partly right. The sound indicated something large was moving, but what exactly? Animals usually didn't circle hunters so discreetly. Boars, especially, are noisy and wouldn't approach like that. We decided to investigate. Alan took the lead, his flashlight scanning the ground for tracks. When we reached the area where the sound seemed to have come from, what we found left us puzzled. They weren't boar tracks or those of any small animal. The marks on the ground were large, much larger than anything we expected to find. They were deep, as if something very heavy had passed through, crushing the leaves and branches beneath its weight. We stood in silence, examining the ground, each of us processing the same question. What kind of creature would leave tracks like this? "This isn't a boar," David murmured, finally breaking the silence. He was right. The marks were too large and too heavy to be from any common forest animal. The unease began to creep in among us. Whatever it was big, and it seemed close. But why hadn't we seen it? And why was it circling us? The confidence we had at the start of the night began to waver. The forest felt darker, more hostile. The legends about the area, which we had joked about earlier, now hung over us like a shadow. And for the first time that night, I started to wonder if we were truly prepared for what was coming. The decision to follow those tracks was, at the very least, risky. Alan, always the most fearless, was the first to suggest that we should find out what was leaving those marks on the ground. All of us, though hesitant, eventually agreed. It was a mix of curiosity and stubbornness. We were convinced that, as experienced hunters, we could handle any situation. But deep down, something told us that the night was about to take a very different turn. We followed the tracks through the woods, moving slowly, our flashlights illuminating the ground ahead of us. The path became increasingly uneven, and the familiar feeling we once had with the forest disappeared. We no longer recognized the terrain around us. The trees seemed taller, denser, and the ground, covered in leaves and branches, became more treacherous with every step. A heavy silence settled between us as we continued to follow the trail, not saying much. "Does anyone know where we are?" David asked, his voice echoing in the darkness. I looked around, trying to get my bearings, but realized we were far from any part of the forest I knew. Every tree looked the same, and the moon, hidden behind thick clouds, offered no clue as to direction. It was as if the forest was swallowing us, guiding us deeper into its heart, to where none of us had ever been. The further we went, the more the confidence we had at the start of the night faded. What had initially seemed like a challenging hunt now turned into a game of uncertainty. We were no longer in control of the situation. We were being led. The trail, which had begun as something strange and intriguing, now felt like a path to an unknown end. But still, we kept going, as if something invisible was pushing us forward. There was a growing sense that we were about to encounter something, but no one knew what. Every noise in the forest made us raise our flashlights quickly, but there was never anything there. Just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind and the sound of our own steps on the uneven ground. The forest, once our ally, now felt like an implacable enemy, closing in around us. I tried to stay calm, but the uncertainty in the air was palpable. We were getting further from where we had started, and the sense of safety we had at the beginning of the night had completely dissolved. The noises started again, this time much closer and more frequent. The snapping of branches and crunching of leaves was now almost constant, as if something was circling us, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Yet strangely, we still hadn't seen any movement. It was as if the forest itself was alive, surrounding us with its mysterious sounds. "This isn't right," Alan finally said, breaking the nervous silence. He was looking around with his flashlight, the confidence on his face now replaced by something we rarely saw in him. Fear. "Are we walking in circles?" he asked, his voice tense. I looked at the trees, at the ground, and realized there was no way to tell. The forest around us was indistinguishable, without landmarks. Everything looked the same, and the tracks we had been following, once clear, were now becoming more scattered, as if whatever was ahead of us had started to pick up speed, or, worse, was leading us somewhere specific. The sound of breaking branches, which had once made us suspicious, now became alarming. Each snap seemed louder, closer, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every few seconds. I tried to focus, to keep my attention on the trail ahead, but the feeling that something large was moving around us wouldn't leave me. No matter where we looked, we never saw anything, but we knew we weren't alone. We started walking faster, our steps now hurried, almost a disguised retreat. The tension among us grew with every minute, and even the most experienced members of the group couldn't hide their nerves anymore. The weight of uncertainty hung over us like a thick cloud. We were losing control of the situation, and what had once seemed like a hunt under our rules had now turned into a reverse chase. Something was watching us, of that we were sure. "Maybe we should head back," Victor suggested, his voice breaking the silence we had been steeped in. No one disagreed. We were getting tired, and whatever was circling us seemed to be getting closer. However, when we finally decided to return, we noticed something that froze the blood in our veins. There were more tracks, and this time, they weren't from an animal. The footprints we saw now were clearly human, large, and barefoot. They were mixed in with the animal tracks we had been following, but they were fresh, recent. I exchanged glances with Alan, and the fear I felt in that moment was indescribable. We weren't alone in this forest, and whoever was out there, watching us, was closer than we had thought. The idea that we weren't alone had already settled in our minds, but finding those barefoot human tracks mixed with the animal ones hit us like a punch to the gut. We stood still, staring at the ground, trying to process what it meant. Someone was out there, watching us, following us. And the fact that we were so deep inside the forest, in a place none of us recognized, made it all the more terrifying. "This can't be happening," Alan whispered, his eyes fixed on the marks. He, the most confident of us all, now showed clear signs of fear. The footprints were fresh, more recent than the animals. And that could only mean one thing. The observer was close, very close. As much as we tried to stay calm, the truth was undeniable. We were being followed, and whatever was stalking us wasn't just a wild animal. The feeling of being hunted grew with every minute, and the sounds around us, once just branches breaking and leaves being trampled, now felt threatening, like a prelude to something about to happen. What had begun as a simple hunt had turned into a dark pursuit, except now, we were the prey. We tried to decide what to do, but our instincts were confused. Running seemed too dangerous. It would make us easy targets. Staying still wasn't an option either. The silence that settled between us was thick, almost palpable. We were panicking, and the uncertainty of what to do was suffocating. Victor, always the rational one, looked at me and said what we were all thinking. "We need to get out of here. Now." I nodded, and without another word, we started to retreat. We tried to keep our pace calm, but with each step, the sense that something, or someone, was hunting us grew stronger. And every time we glanced over our shoulders, that feeling was confirmed. We were being followed, watched. The forest around us seemed alive, as if the trees and shadows were conspiring to trap us there forever. Every sound, every snapped branch heightened our paranoia. Whatever it was toying with us, keeping us on the edge of fear and complete loss of control. As we retreated along the trail, Alan, who was leading the group with his flashlight, suddenly stopped. We bumped into him, and at first, I thought he had tripped. But when I looked at what had made him stop, a chill ran down my spine. On the ground, right in front of us, there were more human footprints, but these were different from the ones we had seen before. They weren't just barefoot, they were smeared with mud and dried blood. Worst of all, they weren't alone. Beside them, as if accompanying the trail, were the same animal tracks we had been following earlier. Panic gripped us. Who, or what, was barefoot in the middle of this forest? And why were the footprints mixed with those of a wild animal? It was as if the line between human and animal had been erased. None of us wanted to say out loud what we were thinking, but the reality was too terrifying to ignore. Something, or someone, was leading us deeper into the forest, drawing us into a place we were never meant to go. "We're not alone here," David said, his voice barely audible. He was pale, his eyes wide and fixed on the marks on the ground. "This is recent." I knew he was right. The footprints were new, as fresh as the leaves falling around us. And now, the fear that had already enveloped us turned into desperation. We tried to quicken our pace, wanting to get out of there as fast as possible. But as we moved, the noises in the forest seemed to pick up speed as well, as if whatever was circling us knew we were trying to escape. That's when Alan crouched, pointing to something ahead. My throat tightened. On the ground, illuminated by the trembling light of his flashlight, was a mark that took my breath away. A footprint, much deeper, much larger. It wasn't human. It wasn't from any animal I recognized. It was something much bigger, something that shouldn't be there. "What the hell is that?" Victor asked, his voice trembling. Reality was becoming unbearable. Whatever it was playing with us. It was smart. And now we knew we weren't just hunters in a forest. We were prey, being closely watched. And when we finally decided it was time to turn back, we realized we were no longer in control. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on us, as if the trees were closing in, and the sound of heavy footsteps in the distance made it all too real. Something was out there. Something was waiting for us. And in that moment, I realized that the forest, with all its secrets, wasn't just a place for hunting. It was a place that held something much older, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The atmosphere around us was suffocating. The darkness closed in, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us there. The noises in the woods grew louder, more threatening. We knew our time was running out, and that's when we realized we were surrounded. The first figures appeared at the edge of our flashlight beams, little more than shadows moving between the trees. Their movements were subtle, but enough to make us stop. We froze for a moment, trying to understand what we were seeing. Were they people? Or something else? "Do you see that?" David whispered, his voice laced with panic. I could barely respond, my body paralyzed by the growing fear. The figures moved slowly, their bodies half hidden by the shadows, as if they were playing with our perception. We couldn't see their faces, but we knew we were being watched, studied. And they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Each of us gripped our rifles tightly, but deep down we knew the weapons wouldn't bring us the safety we once imagined. There was something wrong with those beings, something unnatural. As we tried to process the situation, more of them appeared. Now it was undeniable. We were surrounded. The figures remained in the shadows, silent, but it was clear they were in control of the situation. We were no longer the hunters, but the prey, lured into a meticulously planned trap. Panic began to take hold of us. Alan, always the bravest, was standing still, his eyes fixed on the shadows moving around us. Victor was trying to keep calm, but his face was pale, his lips trembling. I knew we had to do something, but any rash action could put us in even more danger. Our hearts pounded in unison, driven by terror. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered, trying not to draw the attention of the figures surrounding us. With a quick exchange of desperate glances, we made the only decision possible: run. As we began to run, the sound of our feet crunching dry leaves and breaking branches echoed through the forest. It was as if the ground was screaming our location. The figures in the shadows didn't react immediately, but we knew we couldn't stop. The fear drove us to keep going, even as our lungs burned and our legs began to give out from exhaustion. The sound of footsteps behind us soon began to echo through the darkness, a terrible reminder that we were not alone. The forest, which had once seemed like familiar terrain, now transformed into a treacherous labyrinth. The trees seemed denser, the branches grabbing at us as we ran, as if the forest itself was trying to capture us. The figures continued to surround us, moving in the shadows, silent but ever-present. It wasn't just a chase, it was a game we were losing. Alan was in front, lighting the way with his trembling flashlight. The beam of light shook with every step, making the scene even more surreal. We could hear whispers in the distance, mixed with the sound of footsteps, as if the figures were speaking to each other, discussing what to do with us. Every passing second made the escape more desperate, and fear pushed us forward, without looking back. "Don't stop," I shouted, feeling the growing desperation. "Keep running." My body was exhausted, but the fear overpowered any sense of fatigue. The sound of footsteps behind us grew closer. I could hear the weight of the figures moving, getting nearer. It was as if they were waiting for the right moment to catch up to us, to corner us in the darkness. And with every step we took, I knew we were at a disadvantage. The run seemed endless. The path ahead of us was unknown, and the forest's darkness seemed never-ending. Victor stumbled on a root, almost falling, but Alan pulled him up to keep going. We couldn't afford to stop for even a second. Suddenly, we saw a light in the distance, faint, but enough to give us a new surge of hope. It was the edge of the forest, the trail back to where we had started. The relief was immediate, but we also knew we weren't out of danger. The figures in the shadows wouldn't stop there. They had led us to this point on purpose, and now we were running for our lives. Finally, we crossed the tree line, and the sound of footsteps behind us stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noises that had chased us. We stopped, panting, looking back. The forest now seemed calm, as if none of it had happened. But we knew better. The figures were there, hidden in the darkness, waiting and watching. None of us spoke on the way back. The terror of that night had marked us deeply. We knew that whatever was in that forest, human or not, wasn't something we ever wanted to face again. And as we walked away, one final thought crossed my mind. We were the hunters, but that forest belonged to something much older and much greater than us. If I had known what awaited us in that forest, I would never have agreed to spend the night there. The watchtower, with its old and rusted structure, seemed like the perfect spot for us, seasoned hunters, to spend the night and get the best view for the following morning. David, my longtime hunting partner, and I decided to explore a more isolated part of the nature reserve, a place that, from what we'd heard, was rarely visited. And that's how we found that tower, hidden among the tall trees, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. The day had been productive. We had walked for hours, tracking animal signs, preparing for the big hunt the next day. When we spotted the old tower, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get a wide view of the forest at dawn. "This'll make a good lookout," David said with a smile. I agreed, despite feeling a slight unease. Maybe it was the isolation or the way the wind moved the tree branches so quietly. But at that moment, I didn't think much of it. We were tired and needed rest. The tower, although old, seemed sturdy enough for one night. We climbed the rusty stairs, which creaked under our weight, and soon we were at the top, setting up our gear and preparing the area to sleep. The view was breathtaking. The trees stretched for miles, and the sky was beginning to turn orange as the sun set. For a brief moment, peace enveloped us. We were far from everything, alone with nature, just as we liked. However, as night fell, a strange feeling settled in. The wind seemed to carry something different, something unsettling. But, as usual, we laughed off our own paranoia. We were just tired, or at least that's what we wanted to believe. We lit a small fire at the top of the tower, talked about the hunt the next day, and tried to relax. But the feeling that we were being watched never completely left us. Little did we know that this would be a night we'd never forget. The night was quiet until it started. At first, it was just the sound of the wind, rustling the leaves, but soon other sounds emerged. Sounds that didn't belong to the forest. I heard a snap, like branches breaking in the distance, and instinctively looked at David, who was already on alert. I stayed silent for a moment, trying to make out the sound, but soon it repeated. Footsteps, heavy, slowly approaching the base of the tower. David stood up, grabbing his rifle and aiming in the direction of the sound, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see through the darkness below. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my heart now pounding faster. The steps were rhythmic, precise, and getting closer. I tried to convince myself it could be a large animal, but the regularity of the steps didn't make sense. It wasn't the sound of paws, but of human feet. When the footsteps finally stopped, the forest fell into a deep, disturbing silence. David lowered his rifle, still on high alert, and that's when he saw it. Between the trees, a tall, hooded figure. It stood motionless, watching us from a distance, partially hidden in the shadows. We couldn't see its face, but something about the way it stood, unmoving, left us completely unnerved. It wasn't natural. "Who the hell is that?" David muttered, more to himself than to me. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to shine it on the figure, but the moment the beam of light hit the forest, the figure vanished as if it had never been there. The silence returned, but the feeling that something was wrong persisted. We looked at each other, trying to process what had just happened. A hunter? Maybe. But who would be walking alone out here, in the darkness, without making a sound besides the footsteps we'd heard? We tried to calm ourselves, but the tension was palpable. Even after the figure disappeared, the feeling of being watched never left. Something was out there, something we couldn't see, but we knew it was there. And, no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination, we knew we weren't alone in that forest. Whatever it was, it had been watching us, and we had no idea what was coming next. After the sudden disappearance of the figure among the trees, we tried to regain our composure. But the air in the tower felt heavy, and the sensation of being watched seemed to intensify with each passing minute. David and I remained silent, our ears attuned to any sound, as if simply speaking might attract whatever was out there again. The sound of the wind was no longer comforting. Now, every rustle of the leaves felt like it carried an invisible threat. Hours passed, or at least that's how it felt. Even when exhaustion began to settle in, neither of us dared close our eyes for more than a few seconds. The image of that hooded figure, standing still and watching us from the darkness, lingered in my mind. We tried to rationalize what we saw. "It must have been another hunter," I said, though the words sounded hollow even to me. "Or maybe someone from the reserve, patrolling." David just nodded, but it was clear he didn't believe it either. The way that figure had vanished without a sound, and the depth of that stare, even from a distance, were not easy things to forget. We felt like something else was happening, something we didn't understand. Finally, we decided to investigate. If it was someone, maybe we could talk and clear up the misunderstanding. We climbed down the tower's stairs, the metal creaking under our feet, echoing in the dark night. The feeling of unease grew stronger as we approached the ground, but we tried to stay in control. Rifles in hand and flashlights pointing toward the forest, we moved cautiously toward where we had seen the figure. When we arrived, there was nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. The ground was untouched, as if no one had passed through that part of the forest for days. The absence of any sign only heightened our unease. We were convinced that what we saw was real, but the forest offered no proof of it. We returned to the tower, trying to push away the growing fear. But no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves we were safe, the feeling of being watched lingered, like a silent shadow following us wherever we went. Dawn brought a false sense of relief. When the first rays of sunlight began to break through the darkness, for a brief moment, it felt like the previous night had been just a bad memory. But what we discovered as soon as we left the tower confirmed that we were far from any kind of safety. The ground around the tower, which had seemed untouched the night before, now clearly showed we were not alone. Large boot prints surrounded the base of the tower. The marks were deep, as if the person, or thing, that made them had spent hours there, watching us. There were dozens of them, circling the tower as if something had been patrolling, monitoring our every move throughout the night. David and I looked at each other, the terror growing in our eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. These were not animal tracks, and they certainly weren't left by another ordinary hunter. This wasn't here last night," David said, his voice low, almost a whisper. He was right. We had checked the area before climbing up to the tower, and the ground had been clear. These footprints appeared during the night, while we were at the top, distracted by the sounds of the forest. As we followed the prints, we realized they came and went, as if the observer had walked around us for a long time. These weren't the tracks of someone just passing through. Someone, or something, had been there, watching us for hours. The thought was terrifying, and the depth of the prints suggested that whoever it was had significant weight. We felt as though we were in an invisible trap, surrounded by a presence we didn't understand. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep calm, though the fear was already creeping up inside me. David agreed, and we quickly started packing up our things. The plan to spend the morning watching animals no longer made any sense. All we wanted now was to get out of that forest as fast as possible. As we began walking back to the main road, the silence of the forest became increasingly unsettling. The absence of any natural sound, no birds, no wind, not even insects, made the atmosphere feel heavy. And even as we moved away, the feeling that we were being followed didn't disappear. Every distant snap of a broken branch seemed to remind us that the observer was still nearby, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. The silence of the forest grew more and more disturbing as we walked back to the main road. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the trees, and with each passing moment, we felt something watching us. There was an invisible, constant presence following our every move. We couldn't see anything, but it was impossible to ignore the snapping of branches in the distance, the creaks coming from the darkness. We were not alone. David and I exchanged quick glances, both of us on edge. We knew something was wrong, but neither of us wanted to say it out loud. Every time a sound echoed around us, we stopped and listened carefully. But each time we paused, the footsteps also stopped, as if the follower was waiting, mimicking our movements. No matter how alert we were, we could never catch whatever was trailing us. The discomfort grew. My hands were sweating as I gripped the rifle, and my mind was already shifting into survival mode. I tried to convince myself it was just a large animal, maybe a deer or even a bear, but none of it made sense. The footprints we saw around the tower, the prints so deep they indicated a weight beyond normal, all pointed to something bigger. Something we couldn't fully see, but that was there. The walk seemed endless. The path back to the road, which had been so simple on the way in, now seemed to stretch on forever. The sound of breaking branches continued, closer now, and the fear that enveloped us made the air almost suffocating. Every time we moved faster, the followers seemed to do the same. It felt like we were being hunted. "Did you hear that?" David asked, out of breath, quickly turning to look at the forest behind us. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "It's really close." I nodded silently, fear gnawing at my courage. We were on the verge of breaking down, and we knew something was about to happen. With each step, the feeling that we were about to be caught grew. But we still couldn't see what was following us, and that made it all the worse. The unknown was terrifying. Then, finally, after a long, tense walk, we saw the road in the distance. Relief washed over us, but it was short-lived. As we approached the edge of the forest, we heard something behind us. Heavy footsteps. Much closer now. We reached the road, panting. The brief sense of relief quickly replaced by absolute dread. We stopped for a moment to catch our breath, believing we were finally safe. But that's when we saw it. The hooded figure, the same one David had spotted the night before, was standing on the road, blocking our way. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched us with a stillness that made my blood run cold. I instinctively raised my rifle, aiming in the direction of the stranger. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely breathe. David did the same, his hands visibly trembling as he aimed at the figure. For a long moment, we stood frozen, staring at this faceless being, shrouded in shadows. Fear and adrenaline coursed through us. There was no pretending this was a coincidence anymore. That presence, whatever it was, had been following us the entire time. "Who are you?" David shouted, his voice filled with desperation, but the stranger didn't respond. There was no movement, just silence, a silence that seemed to scream in our ears. The figure was tall, its silhouette almost indistinct against the dark background of the forest. Under the hood, we couldn't see any face, no features to help us identify whether it was even human. It was as if we were looking at a specter, something that didn't belong to this world. Fear consumed us, and with no other choice, we pulled the triggers. The sound of the shots shattered the silence of the forest, echoing down the road. The bullets hit the figure, but something was wrong. The figure didn't react. No movement, no sound. It was as if the shots had passed through the stranger's body without causing any harm. It remained there, unmoved, unscathed. David and I exchanged a horrified look. This was impossible. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't something we could defeat with weapons. With trembling hands and panic overwhelming us, we lowered our rifles, unsure of what to do next. The figure was still there, staring at us, as if it knew that fear had already beaten us. Let's get out of here," I whispered, my voice cracking, my throat dry with terror. Without waiting for an answer, I turned and started running, feeling the adrenaline surge through my body. David quickly followed. Fear pushed us to run as fast as we could, not looking back, not questioning what had just happened. The hooded figure stayed behind, but the terror of its presence still clung to our hearts. Whatever it wasn't something we could understand. And deep down, we knew we were running from something far bigger than we could ever face. There was no time to think, only to run. The road ahead seemed to stretch on for endless miles, and the sound of our feet pounding the ground echoed in the silence of the forest. My heart hammered in my chest, and all I could do was run, without looking back. The terror of the hooded figure was still etched in my mind, but it was the oppressive sound of nothingness behind us that kept me moving. David ran beside me, his breath short and ragged, fear reflected in his eyes as much as in mine. We didn't exchange words, because there was nothing to say. We knew that no matter how far we went, that figure would remain in our memories forever. Every step we took was driven by pure survival instinct. Even as fatigue began to weigh on our legs, adrenaline kept us pushing forward. The road ahead seemed endless, and the darkness around us closed in more and more. The trees, once just distant shadows, now seemed to crowd around each step, as if the forest itself was alive, trying to pull us back inside. I didn't know if we were fleeing from the figure or from the forest itself, but none of that mattered. We just needed to get out of there. The shots we had fired at the figure still echoed in my mind. Whatever it was, it hadn't reacted in any natural way. No living creature would have remained standing after being hit like that, and yet there it was, unmoved, invincible, as if it was part of the forest, part of something we could never understand. This thought haunted me. We were running from something that transcended our understanding. After what felt like an eternity running along the road, we finally saw a distant light, the entrance to the reserve. It was a beacon of hope, the only proof that the real world still existed outside of that nightmare. With burning lungs and legs about to give out, we quickened our pace, determined to leave the forest behind once and for all. The silence around us grew even more suffocating, as if we were being watched until the very last second. Finally, we crossed the tree line, and the feeling of being followed began to fade, as if the forest had finally let us go. We stopped only when we reached the main road, doubled over in exhaustion, our bodies drained and our minds in shock. There was no celebration, no real relief. We knew that even though we had physically escaped, that hooded figure would haunt our minds forever. We were out of the forest, but what happened in there would never leave us. The days that followed were silent and filled with long periods of reflection. David and I could barely talk about what we had experienced. It was as if, in trying to describe the hooded figure and the fear we had felt, the events lost any rational meaning. Who would believe us, anyway? It wasn't something we could simply explain. We tried to piece together the details, recall every moment, but whatever had chased us in that forest made no sense. There were no footprints to be traced after our escape, no sign of the hooded figure beyond those mysterious tracks around the tower. And yet, we knew it wasn't our imagination. We had seen, heard, and felt that presence in a way that was impossible to deny. The forest held a secret, something we could never fully understand, but that had hunted us relentlessly that night. For a while, we considered taking the story seriously. We thought about reporting the incident to the reserve's administration, telling them what had happened. But with each attempt, the story seemed absurd even to us. What will we say? That a hooded figure, which couldn't be harmed, followed us through the forest and disappeared without a trace? It was the kind of account that would only be met with skepticism and laughter. We silently agreed it was best never to speak of it to anyone else. The experience haunted us in different ways. At night, I would wake up with the feeling that I was still being watched, as if the invisible eyes of that figure were still somewhere, waiting. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I would hear the sound of footsteps in my dreams, branches breaking, and the suffocating silence that hung over us. David wasn't the same either. He was more reserved, more restless, as if the weight of that mystery had eroded his confidence. We made a pact never to return to that forest, to leave that experience behind. We didn't mention the tower, or the shots that had no effect. We decided that our best chance to move on was to pretend that none of it had happened. But deep down, we knew we would never forget what we had seen. The hooded figure, the heavy silence of the forest, and the sheer terror we felt that night would continue to follow us. And as time passed, only one certainty remained. That forest held secrets that should never be discovered, secrets that would never be revealed. If I had known what was about to happen, I would never have entered that forest. What seemed like a simple hunting trip between friends would turn into a nightmare, something that would haunt me forever. The isolation, the forgotten traps, and the feeling that we were being watched. Everything culminated in a night I would never be able to forget. But that morning, as we walked through the dense woods, I had no idea of the danger awaiting us. My name is Lucas, and hunting had always been one of my favorite pastimes. Together with Daniel, my best friend, we decided to explore a remote part of the forest that was rarely visited by others. It seemed like the perfect place for a peaceful hunt, far from the commotion of more crowded areas. Our plan was simple: spend the day hunting rabbits and enjoy the quiet isolation that the wilderness offered. Little did we know that the silence we craved also harbored dark secrets. At first glance, the forest seemed ideal. The soft sound of leaves falling and the rustling of wind through the trees created an almost serene atmosphere. As we walked, we talked about our lives and how good it would be to relax, far from everything. We were confident that it would be a good day, with no worries beyond finding some good game. What we couldn't have predicted was that the real threat didn't come from the animals, but from the forest itself, and the ancient traps it concealed. During our hike, as our boots crushed the dry leaves beneath us, something began to shift. First, we noticed a few old traps, rusted and partially buried in the dirt. They were heavy steel devices, left behind by hunters who must have been there many years ago. They made us cautious, but we weren't overly concerned. We assumed they were abandoned and harmless, just another strange detail in a forest seemingly forgotten by time. But as we ventured deeper, an odd feeling began to settle in. It was as if something was out of place, as though the forest was waiting for the right moment to reveal its secrets. At first, I ignored the sensation, focusing on the hunt. However, what started as an exciting adventure would soon turn into a living nightmare. The sound of Daniel's scream still echoes in my mind, a cruel reminder of how quickly everything can change. We were just getting comfortable in the forest, still adjusting to the idea of being alone when he made one wrong step. His scream was immediate, piercing the tranquil silence of the woods, and in an instant, I saw Daniel on the ground, his leg trapped in one of those steel traps. One of the old ones we had noticed earlier, hidden beneath the leaves and almost invisible. The steel clamped down on his leg with brutal force, and every attempt to move only made him scream louder. I ran to him, my heart pounding, a wave of panic rising in my throat. The sight of the trap made me feel sick. It was one of those used to capture large animals like bears or wolves, and the way it dug into his flesh was indescribably cruel. Each time I tried to pry the steel jaws open, they seemed to grip Daniel even tighter, contorting his face with pain. "Stay calm. I'll get you out," I said, knowing it was a promise I couldn't keep. I didn't have the tools or the strength to open the thing on my own. No matter how hard I tried, the mechanism was relentless, tightening its hold with every movement. Daniel's blood stained the dry leaves around us, and his face was growing pale. That was when the reality of our situation began to set in. We were completely alone. There was no sign of other people, no marked trails to lead us to immediate help. The panic in my eyes was reflected in Daniel's, who was now pale and sweating, struggling to remain calm despite the excruciating pain. We needed help, and fast. With my heart pounding and adrenaline surging through me, I realized the only option was to leave Daniel there and run for help. "I'll be back soon," I promised him, though I had no idea how long it would take. His breathing was ragged, and he could barely respond. With no other choice, I started running, feeling a mix of fear and guilt wash over me. Every step seemed to take me further from safety and deeper into something I couldn't understand. I needed help, but as I sprinted through the forest, a new worry began to creep in. The traps, those we'd seen earlier, were they really abandoned? Or had someone set them recently? I ran through the forest, leaping over roots and dodging branches, my heart racing and my mind spinning in desperation. Every step was driven by the image of Daniel trapped in that steel nightmare, but the farther I ran, the stronger the sense that something was terribly wrong grew. The forest, which had once seemed simply isolated, now felt alive in a disturbing way. And then it hit me. I started to notice. Those old traps we had found earlier weren't as abandoned as we thought. I passed spots that had seemed harmless before, but now I saw the details. Some of the traps that had been partially covered by leaves had been disturbed, as if someone had recently reset them. The ground around them was scuffed, and some were clearly camouflaged, set up for a fresh hunt. But who would be hunting here? And more importantly, why hadn't we seen any signs of other people earlier? Every time I tried to push these thoughts away and focus on finding help, something in the back of my mind told me we were being watched. I wasn't alone in that forest anymore. Suddenly, the woods I thought I knew had transformed into hostile territory, a place where every step needed to be measured, where every sound might mean an invisible danger. And with each passing moment, my worry for Daniel deepened. I had left him behind, injured and defenseless, and now all I could think about was whether I would get back in time. The worst part was the absence of any trail or sign of civilization. We had ventured deep into the forest when the accident happened, and now, the farther I ran, the less I seemed to find any indication of where to look for help. The sounds of the forest, once peaceful and natural, now felt threatening, as though something was moving among the trees. My senses were on high alert, and every snapping twig made me pause, trying to determine if I was truly alone. That's when I began to hear something different: footsteps. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the sound of leaves being crushed underfoot seemed to match my own movements. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound ceased. When I resumed running, it returned. It couldn't be my imagination. Someone, or something, was in the forest, following me. Fear gripped me, and my mind raced as fast as my legs. The only certainty I had was that Daniel was waiting for me, and I needed to return with help before it was too late. But now, along with the urgency of saving my friend, I had to deal with the growing certainty that we were not alone in that forest. The feeling that someone was following me wouldn't go away. Every time I sped up, the footsteps behind me seemed to do the same. It wasn't the echo of my own movements. There was something else there, in the shadows between the trees, watching me, tracking me. Each time I stopped to listen, the sound vanished. And when I moved again, the footsteps resumed, always in the same rhythm, always at a distance that was too unnerving to ignore. Fear crept up my spine like a cold breeze. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the stress of the situation was playing tricks on me, but the feeling wouldn't fade. And it wasn't just the footsteps. The air felt different, heavier, as if the forest itself was watching my every move. Everything around me seemed darker, as though the sun had intentionally hidden, leaving only shadows and indistinct shapes surrounding me. It felt like the space around me was closing in, trying to trap me. The forest, which had felt like a peaceful ally at the start of the morning, was now an enemy. I was lost among tall trees, surrounded by an invisible threat, while my friend lay gravely injured. Fear grew with every minute, and I knew that if I didn't get back to Daniel soon, something much worse could happen. Still, each time I tried to move forward, the footsteps behind me became more obvious, more present. After running for several minutes, I stopped again, trying to listen more carefully. My lungs burned, and sweat dripped from my forehead. The forest was utterly silent, except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. But then, there it was again, the footsteps. They stopped abruptly as I realized they were closer than before. It felt as though I was being hunted by something unseen. I didn't know whether I should run or hide. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, as though a presence, not just human, but something else, was closing in on me. Terror consumed me completely, but I couldn't leave Daniel alone much longer. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread, and decided to push forward, faster this time. The only thing I knew was that I had to get back to my friend, and I had to do it before whatever was following me caught up. My heart pounded with every step. The forest, which had once felt endless, now closed in around me, transforming into a maze of shadows and noises that didn't make sense. Fear pushed me onward, and each time I tried to stop and understand what was happening, something inside me screamed to keep going. I could no longer deny that someone, or something, was hunting me. With each new step, I felt the danger growing closer, as though the forest itself was conspiring against me. I tried to speed up, but every time my feet moved faster, the sounds behind me became clearer. The dry leaves beneath my feet and the snapping branches echoed through the darkness, and it was as if the noise betrayed me, revealing my position to whoever, or whatever, was following me. Fear consumed my mind, mingling with the exhaustion weighing down my body. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to rest. As I ran, my thoughts returned to Daniel, trapped in that steel horror. What if I returned, and he was no longer there? What if something had taken him? The idea was absurd, but the more I thought about it, the more the dread inside me grew. We were in a strange place, surrounded by old traps that someone seemed to have rearranged for purposes I couldn't understand. The fact that I was being followed and that Daniel was alone and vulnerable pushed me to run faster, even as my legs screamed for relief. But then, something changed. The sound behind me stopped suddenly, as if whoever was following me had disappeared into the darkness. My instincts told me to keep moving, but curiosity and fear made me stop. I looked around, trying to catch any movement between the trees, any sign that I wasn't alone. The silence was overwhelming, and for a brief moment, I believed I might have escaped. But that persistent feeling that something was out of place wouldn't leave me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but it was useless. The fear that had once only lingered in the back of my mind was now a palpable presence, suffocating me. I couldn't tell if I was being watched or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I decided I couldn't waste any more time. Daniel was waiting for me, and I couldn't let terror consume me. With trembling hands and nerves on edge, I began running back to where I had left my friend. But deep down, I knew something terrible awaited me. My breathing was erratic by the time I reached the spot where I had left Daniel. The trees around me seemed taller and more oppressive, as though the forest had shifted while I was away. My heart raced, and the fear of finding my friend in an even worse state propelled me forward. But when I finally arrived, what I saw left me frozen in place. The spot where Daniel had been trapped was now empty. The steel trap, which had held his leg, was lying broken on the ground, but there was no sign of him. Panic gripped me instantly. He couldn't have gotten out on his own, not with the injury he had. The air around me felt heavy, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for my reaction. I stood there, panting, trying to make sense of what had happened. Where was Daniel? I called his name over and over, but the only response was the echo of my own voice, fading into the darkness of the forest. The campfire we had made was nearly extinguished, just a few glowing embers remaining. The whole scene seemed frozen in time, as though I had stepped into an alternate reality where the normal rules no longer applied. A shiver ran down my spine as I surveyed the empty space. Something was very wrong. With my heart pounding, I started searching for any sign of Daniel. My hands shook as I sifted through the leaves around me, desperately looking for anything that could give me a clue. That's when I noticed the first blood trail. Small, almost imperceptible droplets dotted the ground, leading deeper into the forest, in a direction different from where I had come. My stomach turned. Daniel was hurt, and now he was missing. The fear that had already consumed me turned into sheer panic. Something had taken him from there, and the thought that Daniel might be being hunted by something, or someone, made me rush to follow the trail. I couldn't abandon him, not now. With my heart in my throat and every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back, I followed the blood trail into the forest, not knowing what I would find at the end of it. As I followed the trail of blood deeper into the forest, the sense of danger grew stronger. Each step seemed to pull me further into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The silence around me was suffocating, as though the forest was watching my every move, ready to swallow any sound. The blood, thin and sporadic, led me down an unfamiliar path, and with each step, my anxiety grew. Where could Daniel be? And why did the trail stop and start again, as if he had been dragged and then released? After several minutes, I reached a point where the blood trail abruptly disappeared. The ground, once stained, was now completely clean, as though nothing had happened. I stood there, scanning the area, waiting for something, anything, that could explain the sudden disappearance of the trail. But all I found was the oppressive silence of the forest. The earth before me seemed untouched, as if no one had ever passed through. It was as though Daniel had been erased, as though he had never existed. Anguish gripped me entirely. I looked around, desperate, but nothing made sense. The forest around me seemed different, darker, more distant from the reality I knew. I tried calling for Daniel again, but my voice came out weak, choked by the growing fear. My heart pounded in my chest as my mind raced for answers. I felt surrounded by something I couldn't see, something that was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And then, I felt it. A cold breeze brushed the back of my neck, like a soft touch, and in that instant, my breath caught in my throat. It was as though something was standing behind me. Every muscle in my body froze with fear, and for a brief second, I couldn't move. Instinct told me to run, but terror kept me rooted to the spot. The sensation of an invisible presence, something inhuman, paralyzed me. Unable to muster the courage to turn around, I stood still for what felt like an eternity. The air around me was heavy, thick with a fear I couldn't explain. The silence of the forest was even more intense, and I knew that whatever was surrounding me was not something I could face. Finally, I made the only decision I had left: run. With my heart racing and panic overwhelming my mind, I started sprinting back the way I had come, trying to escape the presence I knew was watching me. But as I ran, one question haunted me. Where was Daniel? And what had happened to him? The sound of my ragged breathing was the only thing I could hear as I tore through the forest, my legs heavy and my heart pounding uncontrollably in my chest. The trees blurred as I forced myself to keep going, despite the exhaustion and the overwhelming fear. The feeling of being watched never left me. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger with every step I took. Every branch that snapped beneath my feet made me feel like someone was closer, more real. I knew I couldn't run forever. There was nowhere to go except deeper into the forest. We were too far from civilization, and even if I found the edge, I couldn't leave Daniel behind. But what if he was already lost forever? Panic coursed through my veins as that doubt gnawed at me. And then, in the midst of my desperation, I heard something. A sound that made me stop in my tracks. It was a scream, a cry for help, Daniel's voice. I spun toward the sound, my heart racing with a mix of hope and terror. I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Help! Lucas! Daniel was alive. Something inside me reignited, a new surge of energy. Without thinking twice, I ran in the direction of his voice, crashing through branches and bushes, ignoring my exhaustion. The fear was still there, but the need to find my friend was stronger. When I finally reached the source of the sound, I found Daniel leaning against a tree. He was pale, his eyes wide, his body covered in scratches and dirt, but he was alive. My heart nearly stopped when I saw him standing, his leg free from the trap, but he looked visibly confused. He seemed disoriented, and when he saw me, his eyes showed a mix of relief and panic. I don't know what happened," he said, his voice weak. "I was trapped and then everything went dark and now I'm here." Seeing Daniel brought me a brief sense of relief, but something still felt wrong. He was free, but how? There was no sign that he had freed himself, and the trap that had held him had been broken, as if something or someone had helped him. Daniel's lost expression told me that he didn't understand how he had gotten out either. As we tried to piece together what had happened, I felt that strange sensation again, as if the forest around us was alive, watching our every move. There was an invisible force hovering over us, a presence that refused to fully reveal itself but was always there. The night was already falling, and the darkness seemed to conceal much more than shadows between the trees. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to stay calm, but the urgency in my voice was obvious. Daniel nodded, still confused and limping slightly. We both knew that something was terribly wrong with that forest. Something had found us, and we couldn't stay to find out what it was. We tried to gather our things quickly, but the terror of knowing we weren't alone crept into every movement. And that's when it happened. As we shouldered our backpacks, we heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind us. They weren't ours. It was something larger, slower, but deliberate. A deep, heavy breathing followed, as if something was approaching, stalking us. I felt the panic rise in my chest, and Daniel, now more aware, looked at me with pure terror in his eyes. There was no more time. Without looking back, we started running. We knew there was nowhere to go but the edge of the forest, but our only chance was to keep moving. As we ran, the sound of footsteps and breathing persisted, always just behind us, always lurking. The fear was overwhelming, and every second felt like an eternity. We were being hunted, and we didn't know why. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, the darkness around us began to fade. The faint lights of the road appeared in the distance, signaling that we were near the exit. We didn't look back. The feeling that something was about to catch up to us was overwhelming, and every muscle in my body screamed for me not to stop. When we finally crossed the tree line and reached the road, the sound of footsteps and breathing stopped abruptly, as though the forest itself had given up the chase. Standing there, panting and in shock, we knew we would never return to that place. Daniel was still confused about what had happened, but we both knew that whatever was in that forest was not natural. Something, or someone, had been hunting us, and though we had escaped, the feeling of being watched would never fully leave us.